Welcome to Archive of Greatness. In 2011, the world stood still. A frail man in a black turtleneck walked slowly onto a stage, his body weak, but his ideas still powerful enough to shape humanity. He wasn't a president. He wasn't a king. Yet he changed how billions of people live, communicate, work, and dream. He turned computers into art, phones into companions, technology into emotion. But behind the applause, behind the iconic presentations, was a man at war with himself. Brilliant, obsessive, difficult, visionary. This is the story of the man who put the future in our pockets. This is the story of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955. But before he became one of the most influential innovators in history, he was abandoned. His biological parents were young university students. Unprepared. Afraid. So the baby boy was put up for adoption. Paul and Clara Jobs, a humble working-class couple, took him home and raised him as their own. And from the very beginning, Steve believed he was special. Not because he was chosen by the world, but because someone chose him. His father was a mechanic. In a small garage, Paul Jobs taught his son something that would define his life forever. Craftsmanship. Even the parts nobody sees, must be beautiful. That obsession with perfection would later become Apple's philosophy. But Steve was different. Restless. Intense. Always questioning authority. School bored him. Machines fascinated him. And Silicon Valley was beginning to awaken. At just 16 years old, Steve Jobs met another Steve. Steve Wozniak. Quiet. Brilliant. A genius engineer. Where Wozniak built machines, Jobs saw revolutions. Together, they became unstoppable. They played pranks, built illegal phone hacking devices, dreamed about changing the world. And in 1976, inside a small garage, Apple was born. They weren't rich. They weren't powerful. But they had something more dangerous. Belief. Steve Jobs believed computers should not belong only to scientists and corporations. He believed ordinary people deserved powerful technology. Beautiful technology. Human technology. And with the Apple II, everything changed. Sales exploded. The garage startup became a phenomenon. And Steve Jobs became a millionaire before turning 25. But success did not calm him. It fueled him. Steve Jobs wasn't just building computers. He was building experiences. He obsessed over fonts, packaging, colors, sounds. He demanded impossible standards. Employees feared him. Some admired him. Others hated him. But everyone knew one thing. Steve Jobs could see the future before anyone else. Then came the Macintosh. A machine designed not just to function, but to feel magical. The Macintosh introduced the world to graphical computing. Windows. Icons. A mouse. Things we now take for granted, once looked like science fiction. Steve Jobs became the face of innovation itself. But inside Apple, a storm was growing. His perfectionism became brutal. His ambition became dangerous. And eventually, the company he built turned against him. At just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. The company he created rejected him. Imagine that. Your own dream, telling you that you no longer belong. For Steve, it was devastating. Public humiliation. Personal heartbreak. He later said it felt like being punched in the stomach. But sometimes, life hits you hardest when it's preparing you for something greater. Instead of giving up, he started again. He founded Next, a company built around powerful computer systems. The products were expensive and commercially unsuccessful. But Next carried Steve's greatest ideas. And those ideas would later save Apple itself. Then another opportunity appeared. An animation studio called Pixar. Most people ignored it. Steve Jobs saw magic. Steve Jobs purchased Pixar from George Lucas. At the time, it seemed like a strange investment. But Steve understood storytelling, emotion, wonder. And in 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. It became a global success. Steve Jobs was no longer just a tech entrepreneur. He had transformed entertainment itself. And meanwhile, Apple was collapsing. The company that once changed the world was losing direction. They needed a savior. So they called the man they once fired. Steve Jobs came home. When Steve returned to Apple in 1997, the company was weeks away from collapse. Products were confusing. Money was disappearing. Apple was dying. Steve cut projects ruthlessly. Focused the company. Simplified everything. And then, he launched one masterpiece after another. The iMac. The iPod. The iTunes Store. And then, in 2007, came the moment that changed the modern world forever. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. People laughed. Then they realized, he had reinvented the phone. Again. Steve Jobs didn't just predict the future. He forced the future into existence. The iPhone transformed communication, business, photography, social media, human behavior itself. And soon after came the iPad. The world was now living inside devices imagined by one man. But behind the scenes, Steve Jobs was fighting a battle he could not control. In 2003, Steve Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. For a man obsessed with controlling everything, this was the one thing he could not control. Yet even while facing death, he continued creating, continued presenting, continued inspiring millions. And then came one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered. The Stanford commencement speech. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Those words traveled across the world. Not because they came from a billionaire, but because they came from a man staring directly at mortality. Steve Jobs understood something most people never do. Death gives life meaning. Steve Jobs died at the age of 56. The world mourned. Not just because a businessman had died, but because an era had ended. He was imperfect, difficult, relentless, sometimes harsh. But visionaries rarely arrive in gentle forms. Steve Jobs taught humanity that technology could be elegant. That innovation required courage. That creativity could reshape civilization. Today, billions of people carry pieces of his imagination in their pockets. And somewhere, inside every entrepreneur, every creator, every dreamer, lives a small part of Steve Jobs. Some people make products. Some people build companies. But once in a generation, a rare individual changes the way humanity experiences life itself. Steve Jobs was one of those people. A college dropout, who built one of the most valuable companies in history. A man rejected by his own creation, who returned to save it. A dreamer, who placed the future into the hands of billions. And long after the lights dimmed, long after the applause faded, his ideas continued to echo across the world. Because Steve Jobs did not simply create technology. He changed what humanity believed technology could become. And in doing so, he changed the world forever. If you enjoyed this story of greatness, subscribe to the Archive of Greatness for more legendary lives, historic moments, and timeless inspiration. Hit the bell so you never miss the next upload. Let's keep the archive growing together.